you guys are here tonight to hear a presentation about going a little bit further on a paddleboard. A lot of rovers have been on paddleboards. A lot of rovers have taken various kinds of water camping trips in the Boundary Waters and on Lake Superior and on rivers. But Ethan and Andrew have camped from a paddleboard, and they've crossed the Boundary Waters on the border route and also over 200 miles of the Wisconsin River on paddleboards, and plan in 2023 to finish their source to the confluence of the Mississippi River. Andy has been out in the wild since he was just 5 years old with his family, and he has over 50 trips to the Boundary Waters in Canada, Crownland. And in recent years, he and his son, Ethan, have been testing themselves with longer trips, like crossing the Boundary Waters without resupplies on paddleboards. They've talked about some of this at Canoecopia, at REI, at scout camps, and various places. Between the two of them, they have 70 plus years of wilderness camping. So they're rover kinds of people. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Andy and Ethan.
I should add that Ethan as well has been tripping since the age of 5. So we're eager trippers.
All right. So the fantastic intro. So thank you for that. You've taken a big part of my job away from my title, our title slide here, but that's good. Everyone fully understands who we are and why we're here with you today. So I'm going to just jump right in. This is a picture of Dad and I. This is right when we were starting off our trip for the river trip, I believe. This is the day one. It ended up being, nope, I'm backwards. I'm sorry. This picture is from when we did the Boundary Waters trip. So this would be Crane Lake. All set up. We actually ended up with a different configuration with the gear, but we can go through more of that either in the gear section or the Q&A section that we'd like to do later. But other than that, I will give it to Dad for the different SUP types.
So in wanting to do this trip, we had to do some research on SUPs because, of course, some of them aren't appropriate for all this travel in granite country of the Boundary Waters. As you can see, polyboards or plastic boards they're indestructible almost, but I wouldn't want a portage one. They're way too heavy. They can be easily as much as an aluminum canoe. Fiberglass boards, which I have switched to in the Boundary Waters, but they're very fast compared to what we ended up using and got sponsored to use. Carbon fiber boards, of course, would be even better as far as speed wise, but a bit delicate on some of those rocks up there. The mid to high end inflatables, they're made of sort of the same stuff that you would use that like the Marines use with their Zodiacs. It's very, very tough, like a rubberized plastic that's inflated and has little drop stitches so it holds its form. That ended up being a really great choice because they're extremely resistant, and buoyant. They tend to be a little thicker than the other boards as a rule, so they can haul more weight usually.
We also ran into, especially our boards didn't have a very sharp nose on them, so they didn't cut waves very well, and that became a repeating issue on larger lakes, as you can probably imagine. Especially with all the weight that we had on them, they ended up feeling more like barges than water vessels. So that's something we learned very quickly is if you're going to be crossing larger lakes, the inflatable round-nosed style is not what you'd want to go with. If you're thinking about repeating this trip.
Couldn't switch. As Ethan was saying, that the nose of the board is, you can categorize them in a couple of ways. All around boards are pretty close to what we had. I think we had something in between a touring board and an all around board. An all around board looks like a surfboard, more or less. But they have much more efficient noses now out there. But in 2016, when we did this, they did not. We were sponsored by the Red Paddle Company. We got 2 boards from them to do that. So that was pretty awesome. But here's some of the major board companies that I would recommend. There are other ones out there, but these companies makes a quality board. So desirable features in an inflatable would be the higher PSIs. Anything that just goes up to 10 PSI really, when somebody stands out, you can see it'll bowl out on the ends. And so probably won't do what you need to do. Won't have enough layering and not be as tough, as well as not handle gear as well, or weight. So they're lightweight, as you can see, the 20 to 24 pounds, some even less now, which isn't, it makes portaging an awkward board a little easier. Anchor points fore and aft are great for like handles on the ends or on either side of you for portaging multiple different ways. That really helps. And of course, boards pricing is roughly $600 to $1,600. You can go a little below and quite a bit above that.
Something I want to bring up that we may or may not touch on later as well. At one point in the Boundary Waters trip, I did break off my fin, and it made much less of a difference than you would expect. A lot of people that have been on a paddleboard, they haven't been on one with gear on it. And I would say without the gear, it absolutely makes a huge difference. But because of the amount of weight, the shape of the board was pressed into the water a little better. And I honestly didn't notice the difference. We were probably 2 lakes down and maybe even because we were portaging again before I noticed that the fin was gone. And that broke off just due to negligence. I was being reckless in how we were doing a portage, and that's how we lost the fin. But my point is that the shape of the fin underneath, if you're doing a trip like this, may not matter so much, depending on how much weight you have on the board.
And it should be noted that we did a lot to get speed. We did a lot of sitting on the board and using a kayak paddle. So we had 2 types of paddles along. I think it makes a little more difference when you're standing, but not really hardly at all if you're using a kayak paddle.
So we're getting on your SUP, extra deck pad and cushion for kneeling. We actually ended up using our sleep pads as our extra padding. There were yoga mats that were cut to shape. So like little cutouts for where the D-rings were, for where the cords are on the board. I wish I had a top-down image, but I hope you're following along there. A way to secure extra paddle and map. So the boards that we were using had cording on the front and the back. So I was just putting the paddles through both sets of cording. And it was, if you were sitting cross-legged on the board, it would be pretty close to one of your knees. I know that they make adhesive paddle clips that you could use, and I think that would be a great way to do it if your board isn't very wide, but it seemed fine for what we were doing. Definitely make sure that your cording is new. Lots of swaying back and forth on the paddleboard. And honestly, we transported the boards with all the gear on them several times, and I am thankful that there was new cording on there, or I think we would have lost a pack or 2. And bowline, we did end up towing as many times as we could. We would try to tow our paddleboards up a rapids instead of trying to use the portage, assuming it wasn't such a dramatic rapid. So the tow line is everything for that, of course. paddles themselves, weight, type, and pricing. So you want one that's under 30 ounces for any longer trip, or you're holding a lot of weight at chest height for a long period of time. I want to say we were paddling like 6 hours a day ish. So that weight really adds up over time. Ours was the 27, so still pushing the top end there, but they seemed fine. If you're an experienced paddler, then that's not going to be any weight that'll be an issue for you. Straight versus dihedral. This is the best diagram that I could find. This especially applies if you're going to be using a stand-up paddleboard, if you're not going to sit cross-legged like we were doing. If you're putting a lot of power into a stroke with a dihedral, you don't get, when you go for a swing and you put it in the water and you apply a lot of pressure, you'll get this waviness when you're applying pressure, and the dihedral helps to dissipate that. It just cuts through the water a little bit. Obviously, you don't want it to really cut through the water, kind of defeats the purpose of the paddle, I know, but the shape can make a huge difference in control of your blade. But if you're using a kayak paddle, like the spoon style is much more common, and I believe that's what we had on ours. I don't remember the exact style of our kayak paddles, to be honest, but that's seems right.
Ends up being very much a personal preference. I think I preferred the regular spoon, and I believe Ethan preferred the dihedral.
And we even swapped a couple times throughout the trip. At least the first third of the trip, we were trying to figure that out. About halfway through, so about a week in, we had figured out which one we'd liked. And then the pricing is there. Of course, your style, and with anything with camping gear, especially, you can spend an insane amount of money for the same paddle, in a different style or a different material, or custom blade, something like that. But just be aware you don't have to spend an insane amount of money to get a paddle that will work for you in your trip. That's you.
Well, the phrasing says it all. Life is good with the wind at your back. It was wonderful because your body ends up being a sail. It really, really helps a lot. And you would think maybe that it'd be a little unstable from wind at your back, and it's really not. We found the boards, I think we'll go into the width of a board later, but the width of our boards was about 30 inches, and it was very stable. So we really enjoyed that.
We had one day in particular where we had the wind to our back most of the day, and that feels nice, seems nice, but you don't realize how nice it is until you have to go into the wind on a paddleboard. And there was a section where we had gotten too far from our canoes, and we had to come back. I don't even know if it was an eighth of a mile, but it took us 45 minutes of paddling just to get to them. And they were, not that far away. It took all of our energy to get back up. Those were some pretty strong winds, but paddleboards being all on the top of the surface of the water, the wind is really going to take it where it wants you to go. We've got a couple of nice photos in for, again, we are sort of repurposing a presentation. So we got some talking slides in there as well.
You can see how tall, or how little draft there is on a board in that picture. It's not even an inch when it's empty. So where would you want to go with a paddleboard? I think really anything is open. People have traveled from Canada to Mexico along the western shore of the United States. So it really is unlimited in where you can go. But here's some interesting places that I would myself love to go, and have gone on some of them. The maps we used Voyager maps. I like them because it shows a little more territory, and if you have to take a really long trip, you don't have about a third of the maps to pack, And then we took a National Geographic as a backup because it really didn't have much detail. But in an emergency, it could probably get you out.
Permits and registration. Most parks require a permit for access. Boundary Waters is a single fee for any type of use. Most other parks per day or per night. Some states are requiring SUPs. So the main reason we left this one is because we live in Wisconsin, and in Wisconsin, we don't have to register SUPs as a watercraft, but in Minnesota, you do. So it is important that wherever you go, be it in-state or out, that you know what type of watercraft you need to register, especially when it pertains to SUPs. A lot of the times they think of it as nothing more than like a pool toy, and other places are pretty strict on it. So just be aware. Gear, who isn't a gear geek? So this is more of what we used on this particular trip. I'm going to assume that a lot of you know a lot of this already, so I'm going to go at a decent clip. But if there is something you have a question on, please, we love the Q&A section. So we can come back to any of this that we need to. But we did use 2 backpacks, a big and a small one, effectively. We wanted to make sure that the one that we had on our front, because we would dual pack for portages, the smaller one we needed to see over, and they both did need to be waterproof. So I think I had like a school bag style backpack, but it had a zip on from the top to bottom on the front, and it was waterproof zipper and waterproof material. Mostly used for like lunch food and quick access items, like the GPS and things like that were in there. I did also on the river trip, I made a revision where I did keep my food in there, but some of my quicker access items were actually in an even smaller waterproof bag. Mine, I think, was Yeti makes a waterproof pouch that's intended for their coolers, but it has 2 Velcro straps. And so it's got a magnetic seal and then a secondary magnetic seal that is easy to access, but still mostly waterproof. And I kept like my phone, which had its own waterproof case, of course, but also a monocular that I would use to spot out things like dams, like what side of the dam the portage is on from far enough away that we could save a little energy instead of zigzagging our way back and forth. Sleep systems, 1 to 2 person tent with an emergency patch kit. So I actually use a really small 2-person tent. It's an older IKEA that I like. We can talk more about tent weights and things later. But as long as you're keeping things as small as you can, some people like the 2-person tents just because you can keep your gear in there with you. 2-person, 1 person with gear, same thing. But if you're comfortable keeping your pack outside, but under a pack cover, then that works for a lot of people too. 20-degree sleeping bag, I would probably change now. I mean, of course, this varies depending on your season that you're going to be camping in. But actually, Dad recently made a custom quilt instead of doing the sleeping bag system. And I'm super jealous of that and want to do that in the future. It's a full down. It is just down, right?
Yep.
A full down quilt and then sleeping pad underneath. I'm definitely going to want to go that route in the future. Just the pack size is way better. The weight is better. So maybe look into that. Questions you should ask Dad about his quilt later. The ground pad, of course, pack pillow. We did at least the first couple nights, we tried it where we were using the paddleboard as a way to flatten the ground in areas that there weren't great tent locations, as well as making it maybe a little better for sleep. Unfortunately, those boards are a lot harder than they look and make for really weird tent setups. So we didn't end up sticking with that for very long, though it was a neat idea to try. And I encourage some outside of the box thinking. If you can get that to work, it could be pretty interesting. Let's see what else we got. Oh, I did want to bring up the pack pillow. The method of sticking clothes in like a pillowcase as a pillow sounds good, but by the end of a 2-week trip, you don't want your head on those 2-week-old clothes that you haven't really been able to wash. So that's more in there as a joke. A ditty
It's what you
bag.
tell,
Go ahead.
it's what you tell people that you don't like very much to do with for a pillow.
Yeah. So ditty bag, camera, old cell phone, charging cords. This is the type of thing that I would keep in that front pack. Easy access stuff that you might need throughout the day, especially sunscreen, reapplying regularly, every like 3 to 4 hours. Pack towels, pretty self-explanatory stuff in the ditty bag. Again, we're reusing some stuff from a more 101 style course from an earlier Canoecopia. So that's why the format. Some loose gear, toilet paper, hammock, knife. Just pretty 101 stuff. So the gear that we actually took for clothing, I do want to touch on this a little bit. This is pretty much everything clothing wise that we brought. I had 2 pairs of pants and they were both zip off, and I just alternate days and wash them best we could. I don't even know if I changed socks as much as I should have, maybe. But in my defense, we were wearing water shoes because you could get off the board, step on rocks, and not have any issues with it. So I wasn't really wearing socks for the most part. Those water shoes, I think I exclusively wore those. We brought the camp shoes thinking we might need them for portages or maybe some of the rougher campsites. But if you start with a decent pair of water shoes, you can pretty much stick with those. Although we did coin a new phrase that we think is new anyway. On some of the portages, we call it berry toe. Dad and I are easily distracted, especially by sweets. And so you can probably figure out where this is headed. We would grab berries and not look where we're going and mash our toes on roots and rocks. Berry toe. Those shoes don't have a whole lot of frontal protection, unfortunately. Hat, gaiter. So the gaiter, it's like a buff style thing, is not something that I thought I would use very much. And I ended up using it all the time, every day. I looked like an absolute dork, but I always wear a hat. So I had the girder around my neck and I would pull the back end up so I wouldn't have to apply sunscreen on my neck and ears. I loved it. And honestly, it kept me cool too, because you could just dip it in the water. Really didn't think I would use it much. And it came in super handy. Something that I thought I would use and almost never did was there is a buff equivalent of like fingerless gloves. It's the same exact material, super light. And I thought I'd just be dipping my hands in the water to keep them nice and cool. I don't think I kept them on after the 3rd day or 4th day. Just gave up on them altogether. That lighter material, it rolled up, it bunched, it got dirty super fast. I think if you're curious about them, go for it. I think they're actually a fishing glove. I want to say I picked them at like Bass Pro Shops one time. I won't be doing that again. Don't do a whole lot of fishing though. So if that works for you, great. Cookware. So we do typically when we use a trout, go on a paddle trip, we use the MSI style burners. Let me go back. MSR style burners. Mine's the Dragonfly. This is more the style that my dad uses, but similar, at least in function. We have a couple of ground rules for how we decide to pack for things. The big one is pots should be approximately 1 quart per person. That works out really well for most recipes, even ones like homebrew recipes, dehydrated foods. Plates to double as pot lids, utensils, flippers, scrubby, stuff that you're going to be pretty used to seeing. We would probably now switch to, since then, Dad picked up a really lightweight hiker stove. And if we're just boiling water and doing dehydrated foods, we'd probably switch to that instead of the MSR. But that's up for debate. I'm still partial to the MSR style, but maybe that's just what I'm used to. Just a fun picture from, actually, this is immediately after we had passed our canoeists and had to come back to meet up with them. So we were all pretty beat on this particular day. This is a lunch, I believe, on an island that we had to meet on.
I gotta jump in here.
All right, go for it.
So we did have friends that were canoeists that went along the trip with us. We carried our own gear, but they carried their own too. So it was a great trip, great friends. Became even closer, of course, on a long trip, like 2 weeks. We technically did it in 12 days, and that's only, we could have done it in 10, but weather dictated otherwise. So we played it safe, and just a great group. But that's actually the site that we ended up at on a really windy day. Ethan and I were actually surfing with about 75 pounds of gear on our boards. There were like 13, 14 foot swells between peaks. So we were having a blast because we just paddle really, really, really hard and then surf in between those. It was fantastic. Unfortunately, we took a different track of the wind than the canoeists, and they were taking it was rough enough that they were taking water over the back ends of their canoes. So they were really in danger of swamping. That's one advantage, very big advantage to paddleboards is they're floating platforms, so you can't swamp them. We got very wet, but we had a blast right up until they signaled that they had to stop. And so we had to go back upwind, which was the best and worst day of our trip, I think. But
I also learned a pretty harsh lesson that day. So we had gone past that island in that wind, and we were surfing along. To turn to see where they were going, I had sunk one of my paddles in as sort of not an anchor, but just to keep my place on the water, so I could kind of turn around. As I did that, a wave hit from the side, and my reaction forced me to flip all the way over. So thankfully everything was tied in, and I'm literally strapped to a giant inflatable device, which is nice. But it was a pretty scary moment because with all the waves and with all the wind, even though I was in the water, I was still getting carried away pretty quickly. And that's what caused the story I was telling earlier, where we had to paddle back to them. It was like maybe an eighth of a mile, something like that. But it took just an insane amount of time and effort to get to them, even though they could have easily thrown rocks at us. They were so close.
And of course, safety wise, they have something called an ankle leash. It attaches to your board. And of course, we're wearing PFDs. So in reality, we were okay. We would have been very cold and wet had we not been able to get Ethan back up on a board. And it was big enough swells. Yeah. Big enough swells I couldn't get back to him, which was pretty scary as a dad, but everything came out all right. So we are dead tired in that picture.
Yeah.
So
I think it's you.
Yep. So camp food, as you can see there, when you're carrying for a long distance, like we said, we didn't resupply. So 2 weeks worth of food can fit on a board. I think it weighed in the 35-pound range when we took off. And so we really tried to do smart packing. We dehydrated a whole bunch of like chicken and beef and things like that. A trick there that we're showing is pressure cook chicken in a pressure cooker first and then dry it, because it separates the fibers a little bit. So it rehydrates a little bit better. We use an Nalgene, and so if you have dehydrated chicken, it takes a very long time to rehydrate. So right after shoving off, we would generally pour water into an Nalgene with that chicken in it. And by the time dinner rolled around, it'd be good as new, tasty.
We did kind of do it in two. So the trip took 2 weeks, and each week's worth of food was completely different from the second week. So the second week we saw a lot more of like powdered peanut butter, like Dad actually made hardtack for this, because we knew it would last and it wouldn't turn into mush by the end of the trip. Especially having to be in a bear bag going up and down for 10 days, you need to make sure that it's all going to be secure and edible and not unpleasant to eat, although I'd argue hardtack isn't super pleasant to eat. but just, know that second week, a lot of your food needs to be differently put together. I'm choosing poor words, but I'm hoping my point is coming across. You can't have the same type of food the whole way through. It won't make it. You can't have beef jerky that second week.
So like he's saying, we had the powdered peanuts for peanut butter, and we found that adding water, it doesn't have a great taste to rehydrate. So we were adding honey directly into the powder and then mixing that together and put it on the hardtack for a little bit of peanut butter and honey sandwich. It was very good, but it took a little while to learn that trick. But yeah, another friend of ours had what he called a power wrap. Is a tortilla, everything non-refrigerable, tortilla, peanut butter, honey, raisins or dried cranberries, and some sort of nut in there. Something that'll last without going bad.
I wish I could get the recipe for that. That was a genius little meal that he had. And he was nice enough to share one with us. And man, I will be making those in the future.
Something that locally also, like a beef stick, there's a Swiss beef stick called a Lundjäger. It's spelled like land jagger, but it's a lot of beef and a lot of high fat content, so it gives you a lot of energy. So a typical early meal was, we ate a lot of oatmeal, but oatmeal, non-cooking breakfast and lunch, oatmeal, trail bars, coffee, fruit roll. The fruit rolls or fruit bits were a wonderful flavor boost. We did a lot of tuna packets and little pita pockets or flatbreads. It works really well. And again, like you said, beef sticks will last quite a while. And we took something from I think it was Kevin Callahan or somebody in that realm, gave us a little trick, and that was, I had some hard candy. So we had the hard candy at the end of every portage as an incentive. But Bear Creek, I'm sure you guys know, makes a great set of soups and or meals. And so we had some stroganoff, which was a big hit.
I want to bring in a clarification quick on the breakfast oatmeals. We didn't take the time to cook the oatmeal. Dad and I have this, I guess you'd really call it more a tradition or maybe a habit at this point. So first you can pick those instant packet oatmeals, and it can either be like the protein style ones that they make now, or just the standard Quaker Oats packets. But what we do anyway, especially if we're pressed for time, is we'll take them, tear off the top, and just alternate between dry oatmeal and then a swig from the Nalgene, and just go back and forth until you're done and on the board and off you go. It's a little brutal, but actually it's charming in its own way. You're getting your nutrients that you need. It might not be super pleasant depending on what flavor you pick, but that's preference, I guess.
Sometimes I'd pour a little water right into the ripped off oatmeal packet too, but that can get a little messy.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Didn't mean to take over your slide. I just thought that they might like that.
Oh, so later ones. There's oatmeal again. Surprisingly, we can both still eat oatmeal on the multiple trips that we take and have taken since. But the breakfast didn't change that much. Neither did the lunch. But as he explained, we went more towards the hardtack and dried honey or dried peanut butter and some honey. Honey being definitely a heavier item, but it was worth it. And then dinner it's all dried again, saving space and weight.
Something that one of our people that they brought for dinner was they actually did ramen, and then they did dehydrated chicken with it. I didn't realize that real chicken in instant ramen would make such a difference, but it really does. It's a little bulky for what you get, to be honest, but it's pretty light. So consider that just some dehydrated pre-cooked chicken added to some regular ramen. It's pretty good.
Same with you can do that with instant stuffing instead of ramen. Works really well.
That was good, yeah.
So first aid, we tried to keep to the bare minimums. As you said, you're going to do a wilderness first aid workshop. That's a fantastic workshop. I've gone through it. The only thing that you may or may not see normally in something like this is super glue. So that's been used a very long time in the veterinary field instead of stitches. It lasts approximately the same amount of time. And in an emergency situation, it does a good job of closing a wound.
But you don't get to poke your friends. So there's that.
What we would have left behind. So silly me, I brought a candle lantern with a little citronella candle in it. Try to keep bugs away from the tent at night, and maybe to be able to read from. We brought headlamps as well, and I'd just stick with a headlamp. I think we are doing that from now on, or have been doing that from then on. We brought an extra weather radio battery. We had a marine handheld radios that could pick up the weather as well as communicate between the canoes and us, since sometimes we'd get a little distance between us. We didn't need an extra battery. Clothing, yeah, maybe one shirt of a different, like a t-shirt and then a long sleeve shirt. I wouldn't bring extra anything in that department. I ran out of sunscreen because I know myself, I don't spread out the sunscreen too well. So I was a little leery of that. So I used spray and then ran completely out of it. So that didn't work so well.
I forgot about that.
We were borrowing sunscreen and things like that. I'd use a cream 100% from now on, and actually a little stick that looks like a lip
balm.
Lip balm, yeah, but it's sunscreen. I put it on my nose or ears. It was easier to apply that way. We have another little tradition too. So I'll explain fly swatter. Boat flies, just hate boat flies. On a paddleboard, they do not bother you. They go for canoes and boats because you have that little bit of eddy from the wind in the bottom of the boat. But on a board, you don't have that eddy, so they don't bother you nearly as much. So we didn't need a fly swatter, but a bowling pin. We have a little tradition of sneaking something into somebody else's pack, just that's completely unusable and aggravates that person a little bit. This time we actually used, and the last two times we've used a croquet bottle or ball with a smiley face and a frowny face on it, representing who finds it and who hit it.
The game is called Yumi. You forgot to tell him the name.
The ball is called Yumi. Yep. It has a little U, the frowny face, and then it has a little me above the happy face. Fun little game.
Yeah.
So this is. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, from here on out, I'm pretty sure it's just photos, which is usually what we would use for the Q&A section. And after each question, we would rotate the question with the photo. So I'd love to keep that format because we've got, a dozen or so photos here, and we'd really, really love to answer some questions because I know there's stuff that you guys want to ask and maybe we missed or maybe we just touched on and you want some more info. So if we could open up a Q&A, either, I don't know if the chat is the best way to do that. I don't know what your guys' usual way of going about that would be.
We'll cycle through some of those pictures too and explain them.
Okay, I'm going to read through the chat. It looks like there's a couple things in there. It says, the first one we have is, why does recording...
It doesn't pertain to us.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, you could put it in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Great. What kind of pump did you carry for the paddleboard? On that first picture, it had the pump. It was the pump that came with the boards, a ginormous double piston pump that was very awkward to carry and weighed way too much. Since then, we have shifted. They make an adapter for the airport, and it has a standard Schrader valve on the end of it. Then you guys are familiar with bicycles. We got a small, stick style bicycle pump, and we use that instead of the huge, heavy, awkward thing that they give with you. They're fantastic to blow up your board, but we really only wanted one for emergency. So,
which we didn't need on the trip that we were on. We didn't use it at all. It was more of just a safety of mind, oh man, what if type situation, and we didn't have that adapter yet. For the river trip, we ditched the big one and we did use the small one. But because the boards had aged, where they were 4 or 5 years older, and they were one of the first models of that style, my board actually ended up having a very slow leak. So we did use the pump for a while, and then we topped off at one point. Somebody came by and actually Mom came by with the big pump, and we made sure to top it off good for the rest of the trip.
We should explain that too. We're talking about a river trip. So until 2019, we paddled from Stevens Point, Wisconsin to the Mississippi. This next summer, we'll be completing the river, going from the border of the UP down to Stevens Point. So we'll do a source to confluence completion.
How do you compare using a stand-up paddleboard to using a canoe? Briefly, what are the pros and cons, do you think?
I think the first and probably most obvious, but that doesn't reduce the answer, I guess, at any amount. Efficiency is just ridiculously good on a canoe compared to an SUP. Now, we were sitting using it like a kayak style of paddling, but we would watch the canoes in awe as they would do one paddle stroke for every 4 of ours. A big part of that, yes, had to do with the bow shape, because again, actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to go back a few. So I'm going to flash through a bunch of these quick. I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. If I can find the boards, I might have to just go about this route. But the front of these things
There
are quite rounded. Actually, I think even the picture where it's sitting on the water is better, but this also shows the pump. They're just so rounded. I mean, they were probably like this in shape, whereas a cedar strip canoe it's like a knife. But storage capacity is a big deal too. Stability is on the SUP side. I don't know. It's a lot of different things. Comfort. Oh man, comfort. The yoga mats were good. Definitely made a huge difference. They come with like a grippiness that gives a little bit, and that's okay for like a day of paddling. But if you're going to be on your knees or sitting cross-legged the whole time, your ankles will be non-existent. So that's huge. If I could have, go ahead.
It should be noted that in the picture with the car, way at the end, the cedar strip that was taken was had a racing hull, so that was 4-to-1 paddle strokes. And they do this last summer, somebody completed the same trip in 5 days and 10 hours. It's the fastest known crossing on a SUP now. And the boards that they were using for that are extraordinarily sharp in the bow, so they can slice really well. It's still not as efficient as a 2-man canoe. It's more efficient using a kayak paddle than a solo canoe. This last trip we took, somebody accompanied us. One of the Silver Paddles members accompanied us, and we were killing them with our boards, which was a nice change because the same guy was on the trip in a canoe and he was killing us the entire time. So it really just depends on what board, what your balance tolerance, that kind of stuff. But I think a 2-man canoe is more efficient for sure.
I'd also say that portaging overall, I like portaging the SUP better than I did a canoe, especially solo. That board, we could have our big pack, which was probably 75 pounds, and then our front pack, which was anywhere from, let's say, 30 pounds. And then our board, which we carried on our back going up, or, we'd tilt forward, of course. But that was way easier than any canoe would have been, especially in aluminum. Not to say it wasn't punishing, but my preference is clear. In some cases, you can even hold it briefcase style. There's this handles on the sides of the board. If you're going a short distance, that wasn't really that bad either.
They even make a harness that loops over the ends of a paddleboard. I've tried that in the boundary waters. I'm a short guy, so I found it very frustrating on some of the vertical parts of the portages. But they have improved that even. There's a new one that has a hard sort of loop that has a belt and then a shoulder strap. So it supports on your hip instead of hanging from your neck, so to speak, which is, I'd like to try that. It seems like it'd be a good system.
Yeah, we pretty much just held the two side handles behind us and let it rest on our back. We did try using the lead rope from the nose for a little control, especially if we had to bring it down for terrain or to get it under a branch or something. But yeah, I would go with the better method than what we did the first time, especially those longer portages. Do we have a new question?
You said your body acted as a sail. How often was it going the wrong direction?
We got pretty lucky.
Yeah. If you go in the boundary rivers, if you go from west to east, usually the prevailing winds, of course, up there are from the west or from the south. So we got lucky there. You go upstream a little bit doing that, but I'd rather have the wind than the current.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't seem to make a big difference, but when you were going the other way, like backtracking, you noticed it a lot.
And when you talk about the durability of the board, what kind of precautions do you take? Or what do you take along other than you take, I presume, some kind of repair kit? But what other things do you kind of look out for with the paddleboard?
So I go first, Ethan. The only reason why we got a hole in the board is we had to take a break out of wind, and the board was resting on a very sharp rock. So it wiggled its way through a couple of layers. A good board, not the cheapest board in the world, a good board company will have a repair kit. And this is a surprisingly good repair kit. But Ethan can tell you more about how it held. We added a patch.
Yeah, the patch seemed to work pretty well. But before we go through that, I wanted to mention you had put on some hard strips on the bottom. I can't remember whose board it was, but you put some strips on the bottom for protection, and I don't remember what it was.
You can add, I'd go with, unless if you know a ton about glues, you can go through the company's website and use their glue for their patch kits. I don't know, it's magic, but it'll hold lots of things very, very tightly to a board. And surprisingly, a board's slick enough that if you have to register your board, it will have the registration sticker will have a very hard time sticking on your board. We lost most of ours. You have two on the front of your boards for a trip like that. And we both lost at least one of them just because they wouldn't stay.
Yeah. That might have also had something to do with the flexing material, but I'm sure the adhesive was part of it too. But you could put like hard strips on the bottom to help with scoring on the bottom as well. Especially if you're going to be somewhere like the Vonderwaters with that nasty granite. If it can put a score in an aluminum canoe, it'll do the same to an inflatable board for sure. I think
Although
that's
it's taking. Sorry.
No, I was just commentating until the next question came up.
I think it's all of us taking lunch on Lac LaCroix. That was after we crossed the big water section. That was a paddle. We had a good stiff breeze from the south, which means it was a side wind. And Ethan pointed out that if you choke up to one side on a kayak paddle, it helps immensely, keeping you don't have to do a correcting stroke when you do that. So that
At least
helped a
not
lot.
as often. I was pretty much
Right.
down to the blade on that kayak paddle on one side, because you needed every ounce of power that you could, and then the left side you'd come back just to correct your nose, and then right back to a full power stroke. Now that was a really windy day, but anything you could do to maintain efficiency, you had to do. That was a rough lake crossing.
There's some sand. We talked about that before the presentation. There are some fantastic sites with sand beaches and things like that. Lac LaCroix pictographs. That
Wow.
was a fantastic view.
Wow.
From the,
Those handprints go pretty far up too. It's kind of amazing.
we figured that they probably had to do that in the winter because they were taller that we couldn't stand on our boards and reach them. Not that we'd want to, but just for a perspective, we couldn't have reached those. So we think they must have done in the winter. Curtain Falls. This summer, apparently that was a sight to see. Quite a bit of flooding in the Boundary Waters this year. None of those rocks were showing. It was both Ethan and I are not morning people, but I think both of our favorite times to paddle were in the morning. A little bit of fog on the water and just glass.
It was calm.
Yeah, beautiful.
Anytime we could, we would put our site for the night right before a big lake, like Saganaga or Sagnaga, however you want to pronounce it. Our site was right before it opened up, and that was exactly what we needed. That's my biggest lake that I'm afraid of to cross on rough water is Sag. But we had next to still water crossing because we got out early enough, which was awesome.
Got up at 4 a.m. on the water at 5. It was a little rough, but beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this might even be from that day.
Mm-hmm. Table Rock. We're a little out of sequence, but that's a famous spot. That slab of rock there, for those that don't know, is supported by little rocks underneath, and nobody knows why. It's tons of rock is in that slab. Kind of interesting.
Not just on these photographs, but do we have any other questions for the Q&A while I'm rolling through these?
The one interesting point I'll make about a paddleboard, if you're going to use a kayak paddle versus a kayak, you're sitting up a little higher. In a kayak, you're sitting almost in the water at the water line. And so you do need a slightly longer kayak paddle.
That's Dad's dog, for anyone that wants to know.
Anybody need a crossbreed of a goose and a dog? We have one. Birch Lake. Do you want to explain Birch Lake? You can see the sunken tree in the middle there.
Is that the,
Yep.
the quote unquote? Okay. So is it technically a river? No, it is a lake. It felt like
it's
river.
It's dammed up in one section, so that's what causes this, but go ahead.
So it was a narrow part of the lake we're going through. And I think if anyone's been on a river like the Wisconsin River, imagine width like that, maybe 40 feet across at a couple points in the section we were in. There was this still section of the water. And maybe it was the weather of the day. Maybe it was because we were all pretty quiet. It was later in the trip, but we were going along and it was so quiet and still. And the water was so clear. You would look down and there were these rows of trees that instead of having fallen and broken and, being carried away by current or taken over by vegetation, for whatever reason, the section of the lake that just didn't happen. These rows of trees had fallen into the water and stayed there clearly for a very, very long time. And with the stillness of the air, it kind of felt like we were paddling through, I don't know how to just pick my words
Forest
here, but
cemetery.
yeah, like some kind of ancient forest that we just had no business to be in. It was a very cool moment, but I do feel like I was intruding a little bit in that section of the Boundary Waters. Very cool, but I would not like to intrude there again.
Took lunch at Dorothy Mulder's Bacon Rack. That was pretty neat. That's the actual morning that we got up at 4 a.m. for Sag Lake. Kind of a neat grainy picture because there wasn't any light.
Actually, this is a great moment to mention. We had said that there were canoeists with us. There were actually, was it 2 or 3 canoes? Must have been 3. 2?
There's 6 people total. So
at any rate, so there was, Dad had his paddleboard, I had my paddleboard, and then there were the canoeists. And for the most part, we had chosen each of the people with us, not just because we knew that they could go to the Boundary Waters or had been there before, but they each served a role. So there was an EMT with us, there was the wilderness expert with us, we had a navigator. And I want to shout out, especially because this picture is here, our navigator was phenomenal. I think in the entire trip, they sent us down one wrong bay one time. And of course, naturally, we gave them crap about it for the rest of the trip. But I mean, it was moments like this right here. And then this is not the only moment that we had low light or there was, crazy weather or whatever might trip someone up. They were just phenomenal. And I think that really makes a huge difference, especially in a longer trip, because you don't want to spend a day going down the wrong, finger of river or, go the wrong way on a lake or something crazy like that. So I guess that's a huge one that I don't normally think of, is get your navigation down pat, know where you're going to go and where you're going.
I think we're probably wrapping up on time here, but an advantage to a place like St. Croix or the Wisconsin River is you can have cell service, so you can use Google Maps actually the entire time, and it makes it easy.
I'm just going to kind of rattle through these in case there's something big. There's a couple portages that are rough. Those logs behind me there are flat on the ground. I don't know how well that comes through over the internet, but that is a staircase of a portage section. It's pretty harsh. So we definitely either double or triple portage to this section. That was pretty hard.
Lining the canoes.
Yeah, pulling up. The photo is looking downstream. It's kind of hard to tell what the waves the way they are, but I'm looking down the water. the canoes are trying to figure out how they're going to do this, what we just did in a quarter of the time. More beautiful photographs, rough portages, really rough portages.
Those of you familiar with Grand Marais, that was off the hotel looking out East Bay. And a well-earned pizza.
That is the end of our prepared presentation. Again, if anyone has questions, feel free to ask or throw them in the chat and I'll maybe try to answer them on there. But otherwise, that's all we had.
I see some hands applauding. Thank you, guys. Yes. Yep. Just fascinating. That's from Diana. So thank you very much for sharing your adventure. We really appreciate it.